The headlines hit like a sledgehammer. Banks freezing withdrawals, layoffs tearing through industries like a relentless storm, rent deadlines looming, grocery shelves bare, and neighbors quietly selling family heirlooms to keep the lights flickering. In an instant, the fragile safety net that holds society together shreds, and where you live becomes a matter of survival. When America's economy collapses, some states will plummet harder and faster than others. If you're in one of these 10, brace yourself. This isn't just a financial downer. It's a brutal test of economic endurance. Like the video and subscribe to know if your state is on this list. Let's dive into the 10 states most at risk, exploring why they're vulnerable, what would break first, and what it means for residents. This is a deep dive into the fault lines of America's economy, cracks that could become canyons in a crisis. Number 10, New Mexico. New Mexico's economy is tethered to a single lifeline: federal funding. For every dollar the state sends to Washington in taxes, it receives over $3 back, fueling critical sectors like education, healthcare, and infrastructure. In stable times, this arrangement keeps New Mexico afloat, but in an economic crisis, when federal budgets contract, that lifeline frays and snaps, plunging the state into chaos. Government spending is a cornerstone of the state's GDP, with public schools often operating on razor-thin budgets, relying heavily on federal grants to function. Rural hospitals, serving vast and impoverished communities, depend on federal reimbursements to keep their doors open. Government jobs, a rare source of stability in small towns, are the economic backbone of entire regions. If federal funding dries up, schools shutter, hospitals close, and jobs vanish, leaving communities stranded in a financial desert. New Mexico's challenges are compounded by its low rankings in educational outcomes and healthcare access. The private sector is underdeveloped, with few industries capable of filling the void left by federal cuts. Job opportunities are scarce outside urban centers like Albuquerque and Santa Fe, leaving rural areas particularly exposed. Families living paycheck to paycheck face agonizing choices: food or medicine, rent or utilities. Poverty and sparse infrastructure amplify the risk, with social services like SNAP and Medicaid critical for millions facing severe cuts. Crime rates could surge as desperation takes hold, outmigration would accelerate, and the tax base would erode, creating a vicious cycle of decline. New Mexico's over-reliance on federal funds makes it a stark warning of what happens when a single, fragile source collapses. Did New Mexico's vulnerability shock you? Hit that like button if this opened your eyes to the state's economic risks. Share this video with friends in New Mexico to spark a conversation about resilience. Drop a comment below. Tell us how you'd prepare for a crisis in your town. Number 9, West Virginia. West Virginia is no stranger to economic decay, having eroded for decades under the collapse of its coal industry. Once a powerhouse, it's now a patchwork of fading towns, crumbling infrastructure, and entrenched poverty. Over 50% of the state's budget comes from federal funds, making it acutely vulnerable to federal disruptions. When Washington stumbles, West Virginia falls hard. The coal industry's decline has gutted entire counties, leaving low-wage jobs and heavy reliance on federal programs like Medicaid, disability income, and food assistance. If these programs are slashed, schools lose funding, rural clinics run out of supplies, and roads go unrepaired. Schools, already struggling, could close or lose heat in winter, while clinics, vital for isolated communities, might shut entirely, leaving residents without care. The state's social and health crises deepen its fragility. The opioid epidemic has ravaged West Virginia, with overdose rates among the highest in the nation. Federally funded mental health services are stretched thin, and their loss could fuel addiction, suicide, and crime. The aging population, dependent on Medicare and Social Security, faces dire choices: groceries or medications, heat or rent. West Virginia's economy lacks the diversity to absorb shocks, and its infrastructure can't withstand prolonged stress. Residents would face survival decisions with no cushion. just the cold reality of a state left behind. The absence of new industries and the state's geographic isolation exacerbate the risk, making recovery a distant hope. West Virginia's story is a haunting reminder of what happens when an economy fails to evolve, leaving its people to bear the consequences of a collapsing system. If West Virginia's story shook you, share this video to spread awareness. I'd like to keep our channel diving into these critical issues. Drop a comment. How can West Virginia rebuild its economy? Let's start the discussion. Number 8. Mississippi. Mississippi's economic woes are woven into its history. Low GDP, high poverty, and chronically underfunded public services. Over 40% of its annual budget relies on federal funding, making it dangerously exposed to any disruption in Washington. An economic crisis would tear through Mississippi's fragile systems like a wildfire, leaving devastation in its wake. Federal dollars are the lifeblood of the state's public sector, supporting schools that rank among the nation's lowest performing, emergency management critical for a disaster-prone state, and healthcare propped up on Medicaid in rural areas. If these funds vanish, schools close early or permanently, hospitals cut services or shutter, and roads decay, leaving communities stranded. The private sector, dominated by agriculture and low-wage industries, is too weak to compensate for federal losses. In rural counties where federal money is often the only revenue, entire communities could be abandoned. Mississippi's poorest residents, particularly in the Delta region, would face deepened inequities, with federal benefits like SNAP, Medicaid, and school lunches disappearing. Families will be forced to choose between hunger and health, while crime, homelessness, and outmigration surge, shrinking the tax base and perpetuating decline. The state's high poverty rate and limited infrastructure mean there's little to fall back on when systems fail. Mississippi's collapse would be a swift descent into desperation, with the most vulnerable left to fend for themselves. The state's history of systemic challenges, from racial inequities to underinvestment, would amplify the crisis, making recovery a monumental task. Mississippi stands as a stark example of what happens when a state's economy is built on fragile foundations. If Mississippi's story shook you, share this video to wake others up. I'd like to support our deep dives into America's economic risks. Drop a comment. How can Mississippi fight poverty in a crisis? Let's get talking. Number 7. Louisiana. Louisiana's economy teeters on a tightrope, propped up by volatile industries. Oil, gas, agriculture, and tourism. Each is one disaster, a hurricane, market crash, or recession away from collapse. Federal funds, comprising nearly half the state's budget, sustain schools, clinics, and food programs. In an economic crisis, those funds could disappear, sending Louisiana into a freefall. The state's education system, already among the weakest nationally, would be the first to break, with rural schools reliant on federal grants facing closures or severe cuts. Healthcare, particularly in rural areas, depends on federal reimbursements, and its loss would leave communities without care. Food programs like SNAP and WIC, critical for low-income families, single mothers, and rural elders, would shrink, deepening poverty. Louisiana's geography amplifies its vulnerability. Its hurricane-battered coastline requires constant federal investment for levees and infrastructure. Without it, coastal communities face existential threats, with crumbling defenses and eroding land. The memory of Hurricane Katrina looms large, a grim reminder of what happens when systems fail and help doesn't arrive. In a collapse, Louisiana could relive that nightmare, with the poorest residents trapped in the wreckage. High poverty rates and limited economic diversity leave little fallback when federal support vanishes. Evacuation isn't an option for those who are broke, sick, or caring for dependents, leaving them to face the storm alone. Louisiana's tightrope would snap, and the fall would be catastrophic, with ripple effects felt across the Gulf Coast. The state's reliance on volatile industries and federal aid makes it a cautionary tale of economic fragility in the face of a national crisis. Louisiana's risks are intense. Did this at home? Like this video if you're shocked by the state's exposure. Share it with your Louisiana crew to get them thinking. Comment below, what's one way to protect your community from crash? Number 6. Kentucky. Kentucky's economy is a fading relic of its coal-driven past. As the industry collapses, the state struggles to adapt with slow job growth, lagging education, and patchy healthcare. Over 45% of the state's budget comes from federal funds, propping up schools, roads, and medical clinics. In an economic crash, that support would vanish, leaving Kentucky's communities exposed. Coal's decline has already hollowed out entire towns, leaving shuttered businesses and abandoned homes. Federal aid has been a bandage, keeping schools operational and clinics functioning. But if it's cut, the wound reopens. Schools would lose teachers and resources, forcing closures. Rural clinics, critical for isolated areas, would operate sporadically or close, leaving residents without care. Kentucky's aging population heightens the risk, with many relying on Medicaid and Medicare for health care. Cuts would deny access to critical services, forcing choices between medications and basic needs. The education system, already under strain, would face further reductions, stifling workforce development and economic diversification. Without new industries, Kentucky's future is bleak, with geographic isolation and crumbling infrastructure compounding the challenges. Residents would face stark realities with no safety net, just a state left to decay. The loss of federal support would ripple through every sector, from healthcare to transportation, leaving communities stranded. Kentucky's story is a grim reminder of what happens when an economy fails to evolve, leaving its people to bear the brunt of a collapsing system. The state's reliance on a dying industry and federal aid makes it a stark example of vulnerability in a national crisis. Kentucky's risks are real. Did this shock you? Like this video if you're stunned by the state's fragility. Share it with your Kentucky friends to spark action. Comment below, what's one step your town could take to prepare? Number 5. Nevada. Nevada's economy is a high-stakes gamble built on tourism, with casinos, hotels, and Las Vegas driving revenue. When travel stops, due to a recession, pandemic, or collapse, the money dries up. During COVID, Las Vegas became a ghost town, and an economic crash would be far worse. Tourism accounts for a massive portion of Nevada's GDP, and its taxes fund public services. If travel halts, revenues plummet, and unemployment skyrockets as casinos and hotels shutter. Public programs, from schools to infrastructure, would be gutted, and Nevada's lack of a state income tax leaves no fallback revenue. Schools would close or operate on skeleton budgets, while rural healthcare, already limited, would deteriorate further. Service workers, a significant portion of Nevada's workforce, would face mass layoffs with no safety net, plunging families into poverty. The state's glittering excess would give way to an economic desert, with Las Vegas's lights going dark. Nevada's reliance on a single industry makes it uniquely vulnerable, with little economic diversity to absorb shocks. The loss of tourism revenue would ripple through every sector, from education to public safety, leaving communities struggling to survive. Rural areas, already underserved, would face even greater isolation, with crumbling infrastructure and limited access to resources. Nevada's story is a stark warning of what happens when an economy bets everything on one fragile sector, leaving its people to face the consequences of a collapsing system. The state's lack of a financial cushion makes it a prime example of economic fragility in a national crisis. If Nevada's story stunned you, share this video to spread the word. Hit like to keep our channel exposing these risks. Drop a comment. How can Nevada diversify its economy? Let's dive in. Number 4. Illinois. Illinois is drowning in a sea of debt, with tens of billions in unfunded pension liabilities and a credit rating teetering on junk status. Borrowing keeps the state afloat, but in an economic crash, borrowing becomes impossible, spelling disaster for a state reliant on borrowed dollars. The pension crisis is Illinois' Achilles heel, with teachers, police, and state workers depending on pensions the state can't fully fund. In a collapse, delayed or defaulted checks would spark panic, eroding trust in institutions. The tax base, already stretched thin, would collapse as businesses and residents flee high taxes and crumbling services. Schools would close, public transit would stall, and infrastructure would deteriorate, with Chicago, the state's economic engine, buckling under its own mismanagement. Illinois' problems stem from decades of fiscal rot, with mismanaged budgets and political gridlock exacerbating the crisis. A crash would expose this decay, igniting a fiscal firestorm that leaves residents in chaos. The loss of public services would hit the most vulnerable hardest, with low-income families and rural communities facing the brunt of cuts. Illinois' collapse would be a loud, sudden unraveling, with ripple effects felt across the Midwest. The state's story is a cautionary tale of what happens when debt and mismanagement collide with a national crisis, leaving a once thriving region to grapple with the consequences of its own failures. Illinois' debt crisis is insane. Did this shock you? Like this video if you're stunned by the state's risks. Share it with your Illinois friends to spark action. Comment below, what's one way your community could fight back? Number 3. New Jersey. New Jersey's high cost of living comes with sky-high taxes, crumbling infrastructure, and one of the nation's most underfunded pension systems. In an economic crash, the bill comes due, and the state can't refinance its way out. Property values would plummet, drying up tax revenue and gutting public services. Pensions, critical for teachers, police, and state workers, could be delayed or defaulted, triggering panic and distrust. The state's high debt-to-GDP ratio makes it toxic to investors, and raising taxes would drive residents and businesses away, accelerating a fiscal doom loop that spirals out of control. New Jersey's challenges are rooted in years of fiscal mismanagement and over-reliance on borrowing. A crash would expose these weaknesses, leaving schools, hospitals, and transportation systems in disarray. The state's high cost of living would exacerbate the crisis, with residents struggling to afford basics as services collapse. Rural and urban communities alike would face cuts, with low-income families hit hardest by the loss of social programs. New Jersey's collapse would be swift and brutal, with ripple effects felt across the Northeast. The state's story is a stark warning of what happens when high costs and poor planning collide with a national crisis, leaving residents to navigate a crumbling system with no clear path to recovery. The absence of structural reforms makes New Jersey a ticking time bomb in an economic downer. If New Jersey's story stunned you, share this video to spread the word. They like to keep our channel exposing these risks. Drop a comment. How can New Jersey fix its pensions? Let's dive in. Number 2. California. California's wealth, Hollywood, Silicon Valley, coastal allure, mass a fragile foundation built on bubbles, tech, real estate, and venture capital. Pop these, and shockwaves are seismic. The state's progressive tax structure relies heavily on wealthy earners, whose capital gains fuel the budget. In a crash, when these earners make less or flee, revenue collapses, gutting billion-dollar programs like universal healthcare trials, green energy initiatives, and massive school systems. The housing crisis, already dire, would worsen, with homelessness spiking as affordability plummets. California's problems scale with its size, turning a decline into a supernova, spectacular and destructive. The state's high cost of living and sprawling infrastructure amplify the risk. A crash would strain public services, from transportation to healthcare, leaving urban and rural communities struggling. Low-income residents, already stretched, would face the brunt of cuts to social programs, while the state's environmental initiatives could stall, exacerbating climate risks. California's reliance on volatile industries and progressive taxation makes it a prime example of economic fragility, with little cushion to absorb shocks. The loss of revenue would ripple through every sector, from education to public safety, leaving the state grappling with a crisis of unprecedented scale. California's story is a cautionary tale of what happens when wealth and ambition outpace resilience, leaving a golden state to face the consequences of its own excesses. California's risks are huge. Did this shock you? Like this video if you're stunned by the state's exposure. Share it with your California friends to spark action. Comment below, what's one way your community could prepare for a crash? Number 1. New York. New York is America's economic heartbeat, but its arteries are clogged with vulnerabilities. Wall Street, real estate, and tourism are crash-prone industries. If they falter, the state and the nation shakes. New York carries massive debt and relies heavily on high earners for tax revenue. If financial firms collapse or relocate, the tax base implodes, forcing brutal cuts to expansive social programs, schools, and hospitals. The cost of living, already suffocating, would strangle more residents, with no relief in sight. A collapse in New York wouldn't stay local. It would ripple globally, shaking the foundations of the American economy. The state's urban and rural divide exacerbates the risk. New York City, the economic engine, faces its own fiscal challenges, while upstate communities rely on state and federal aid to survive. A crash would hit both hard, with crumbling infrastructure, strained healthcare, and failing schools. The loss of public services would disproportionately affect low-income residents, deepening inequities. New York's story is a stark warning of what happens when a state bets heavily on volatile industries and high earners, leaving little room for error in a crisis. The absence of a financial cushion makes New York a prime example of economic fragility, with a collapse that could redefine the nation's economic landscape. If New York's story stunned you, share this video to spread the warning. I'd like to keep our channel exposing these risks. Drop a comment. How can New York stay strong in a crisis? Let's dive in. Did your state make the list? If not, don't get complacent. This is a wake-up call for everyone. A crash may be coming, but collapse can be avoided. If you're in one of these states, act now, prepare, organize, and demand resilience. When the music stops, make sure you've got a chair. The fault lines in America's economy are clear, and the states on this list are the most exposed. But knowledge is power. Use it to protect yourself and your community. Stay informed, stay sharp, and stay ready. Like this video if you learned something new about America's economic risks. Share it if your state is in the danger zone to spark urgent conversations. Drop a comment below. Tell us which state's story hit you hardest and why. Subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the issues that matter. Let's keep the discussion going.